Hello, this is my inquiry of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, known as ADHD. In this presentation, I will skip through the slides for the sake of time. The main goal or question I wanted to answer was, is ADHD caused by genetics, environmental factors, or both? The difference between ADHD and ADD is that ADD is attention deficit disorder, but it's outdated and now is considered part of ADHD. I actually will explain this in the next couple slides. ADHD defined as a persistent pattern of inattention and/or hyperactivity impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development as characterized by 1 and/or 2. So according to the DSM-5, inattention is the criteria that previously described attention deficit disorder, or ADD. And hyperactivity and impulsivity, this is the criteria that describes the hyperactivity aspect. So now ADD is not a diagnosis anymore, and it is more considered the inattention aspect of ADHD. Here are the symptoms of the inattention part of ADHD. And here are the symptoms of the hyperactivity and impulsivity of ADHD. And for both of them, there are more symptoms listed in the DSM-5. Basically, if a child is diagnosed with ADHD, that does not necessarily mean they're hyperactive. They will have a more specific diagnosis of either 1, the inattention, or 2, the hyperactivity and impulsivity diagnosis. And let me just quickly say, inattention, the child, in a nutshell, since I don't have time to explain, they have trouble paying attention, they cannot keep their attention for long periods of time, they get very easily distracted, they appear more calm than children who are hyperactive. These children appear to be driven by a motor, they're on the go, they talk excessively, interrupt, and cannot sit still for some of these symptoms. And their brain is processing things so quickly, it impedes their ability to pay attention. The prevalence of ADHD is pretty alarming in the United States. 5.4 million children are currently diagnosed with ADHD. Males are also 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than females, and I actually will talk about this more later in the presentation. And on the right-hand side, you can see in the chart that there are 3 diagnoses of ADHD: severe, moderate, and mild, moderate being the most common. This is also for children from ages 2 to 17. I will skip through this. This is just ADHD amongst races in the United States for children of ages 2 to 17. And on a global scale, to be brief, for children 18 and under, 7.2% of the population, or 129 million children, are diagnosed with ADHD, and that number is growing. Here are coexisting conditions with ADHD. This is important for teachers to know so that if they have a child in the classroom with ADHD, they can be aware of what else they might be experiencing. Is ADHD genetic? Exact causes of ADHD are unknown, but possible reasons are known. Even though there's no lab or blood test for ADHD, they're very successful assessment measures that have been proven to work for decades. And evidence is growing that ADHD is heritable. And to move on to the next slide, more genetic information about ADHD. People that have ADHD seem to have lower levels of dopamine in the brain. And there's been relations with relatives who have ADHD, and also brain tissue has appeared to be thinner when associated with attention in the areas of the brain. And it's not permanent though. As the person with ADHD grows older, the tissue in the brain becomes more thick, and the symptoms of ADHD subside, which is very fascinating, and that's strong evidence that this is genetic. And there have been several twin studies that have suggested that ADHD is genetic. On to the next slide. Oh, okay. Talking about environmental influences. Screen exposure and ADHD correlation. There was a strong correlation between watching TV and video games and all of this technology exposure and ADHD diagnoses. I encourage people to read through the facts. I will just summarize here, but basically the more TV that was watched increased the likelihood of having attention problems and difficulty concentrating, especially for children of a young age. So infants and young children below the age of 3, while their brains are developing, these rapidly moving images on the TV and video games, it's overstimulating and it can rewire the brain. And it makes it difficult for them to focus on slower tasks that require more thought. So it is damaging to their cognitive development, and the TV affects centers in the prefrontal cortex of the brain that's responsible for organizing, planning, and sequencing thought. All of those children with ADHD struggle with. When considering the environment, to summarize this slide, parents or guardians who are uninvolved, they're less likely to be able to help their children who have ADHD if they're not home, or they don't care enough to be strict with rules and structure and routines that help improve these attention and behavioral problems. And it's just not a good environment for a child with ADHD. On the other hand, if a child with ADHD is in a wonderful environment that's beneficial for them, and the parents are involved and they're setting these great routines and structures for them and helping them complete their homework and training their attention spans to improve, then that will definitely have a great effect on them. So it is important to consider how the environment can impact ADHD symptoms. Lead poisoning is another contributor. I won't go too far into this, but I really suggest people read about lead poisoning because it is an issue in the United States, especially for children under the age of 6. That can be the most detrimental and damaging. Lead exposure can exacerbate a child's inherited ADHD risk. That has been proven. And ADHD medication and the brain. Basically, ADHD is a result of a chemical imbalance, and the medication is improving this balance through it improves the availability of neurotransmitters in the brain so that the message can successfully get to its destination. So for a person that has ADHD, the brain is not functioning properly. Those messages are being stopped short, and they're not making it a path across the neural pathway. Here's a list of ADHD medications and some more facts. I will have to go through this for the sake of time. Here are side effects. It's important to know that these side effects can successfully be managed through adjustments of dosage, schedule of medication, and also changing the medication. All those medications on the previous slide can be changed, and certain medications will work for certain people. Personal experience. I was diagnosed with mild ADD when I was 14. In 2008, and I tried many medications that all had unpleasant side effects, and finally in high school I tried Ritalin, and that was very successful for me. When I was a child, I definitely was inattentive. I zoned out a lot in class. I avoided tasks I didn't like. My attention span was very short. I got very distracted by extraneous stimuli, and it was very difficult to pay attention in class. And my teachers, unfortunately, would yell at me, and that really damaged my self-esteem and my confidence. This talks about my cousin, who is 13 years older than me, and how she and I share a lot of the same symptoms. And she also had mild ADD, and she took Ritalin that was successful for her. And as we both grew older and reached college age, our ADD symptoms actually drastically subsided, which is a interesting relation. And when I was younger, I watched a lot of TV. So, considering the environmental influence, I feel that the TV may have worsened my symptoms. I watched a lot of cartoons with fast moving frames. And in my home environment, my parents were not aware of this issue too much, so they did not know to be disciplined and carry out behavioral modification. And so if I didn't want to do a difficult homework assignment, I just avoided it. And I watched a lot of TV. So how does ADHD connect to the classroom perspective? For the sake of time, I might skip through this as well. But I listed what I think is important for teachers to know. I will say this: teachers need to be patient with children with ADHD. They need to understand that it's not their fault, and we have to build up their confidence so that they can perform better, and that they can improve their attention skills. And we should be aware of ADHD criteria, accommodate, be in communication with school psychologists and counselors, and etc. I interviewed my old babysitter, Karen Robinson. She's a placement director with a master's degree in special education. And I also interviewed my aunt. Her name is Lisa Van Vechten, and she's a primary Montessori directress. I will have to be brief when explaining these interviews, but basically they said both of them can tell when a student has ADD or ADHD through observation, and sometimes it's just obvious and they can tell they're not paying attention, they can't sit still. Karen Robinson mentioned a really interesting point that I talked about earlier with the statistic that boys are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than girls. She said that girls are better at covering ADHD symptoms than boys. They don't want to be embarrassed in class and draw attention to themselves, so they hide that they're not paying attention, but they're more concerned with it. But boys, on the other hand, are more obvious. They said that each year, well, my aunt in the Montessori classroom, she said that every year she has 3 to 4 students that have ADHD, and they both have recognized an increase in this in the symptoms of ADHD over the years. My aunt, or Lisa Van Vechten, she said that she's noticed it the most in the recent 3 years. They both believe that ADHD is caused by genetics and environmental factors. They both support medication and think it should be used as a tool alongside with strategies, behavioral modification, and they think overall it does help. When talking about strategies, especially for the children who are hyperactive, holding a fidget, sitting on a ball, getting up to walk around the room, these are suggested strategies and accommodations that will help them in the long run pay attention and help their symptoms overall, and they can become a better performing student. And with what my aunt said, Lisa Van Vechten, who works in the Montessori school, she said that completing manageable tasks such as in the practical life activities in a Montessori classroom can be very beneficial for a student with ADHD. For instance, baking bread. They will work hard, they they will put their focus on to completing this manageable task, and then they see the outcome. The bread is tangible and they see that they were successful. Then in turn, they will have the confidence to tackle something more cognitively challenging, such as math or writing. She said that giving one command at a time and gentle time reminders and allowing extra time to complete tasks is very beneficial for them. And there are more listed here. And my final thoughts, I do believe ADHD is genetic. And I think more evidence will come out in the years to come to prove this. But I also believe that environmental influences and social factors have a major impact on ADHD symptoms in children and even adults too. And it can improve or worsen the symptoms. So, with that being said, I also think that the correlation between the increase of technology in the past 10 years and screen exposure for young children is damaging to the ADHD symptoms and is a major contributor to the rise of ADHD diagnoses. And here are my sources. And if you have any questions, please let me know. And thank you so much for listening.